Welcome back to another episode of the Teacher Transition Expert Series. On today's episode, we have the pleasure of being joined by Ben Erwin. Ben is an instructional designer who has turned quite the LinkedIn expert. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about all the things about what is instructional design, what does it take to be an instructional design, and what does a true teacher transition look like, as well as we leave you with some hot takes that you'll want to tune in to the end to see. So, as always, thank you for joining us, and let's get ready to do this. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Leena Marie Saleh, the Edtech Guru. I want to thank you so much for spending time with me on this journey, for all the support that you give me, and for following along. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe, and let's get ready to do this. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode. Today, we are joined by Ben Erwin. Ben is an instructional designer and has become quite a teacher transition expert, I would say, or cheerleader. So, Ben, we are so happy to have you on today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat. I'm always happy to talk about teacher transitioners and try to lend a hand or some tips that might hopefully help people.
Yes, I love that. Well, let's dig in, and we'd love to hear a little bit about you and basically how you got to where you are today.
Okay. So I initially began my career as a journalist. I worked for the better part of a decade as a reporter, as a copy editor, as an editor. Very quickly realized that that was not the career path for me, but I wanted to work with writers. So that led to a transition into academia. Previously, I served as a writing center director at a university for 12 years, where I taught writing in the writing department. I tutored students and staff one-on-one in the writing center and served as the director, which encompassed a whole host of academic duties like hiring, training, onboarding, designing professional development, collaborating across campus. So it was a real catch-all position that included a wealth of roles and responsibilities. After serving in that capacity for more than a decade, I recently, in August of 2023, made a transition out of the classroom and into working for another university as an instructional designer in their course production department, which essentially means that in my role specifically, I work with faculty members in their engineering department to design curriculum and course content for online courses. And I also oversee a variety of courses in their non-credit space. So various certifications, things like Lean Six Sigma is another facet of my role as an ID.
Oh, I love that. And thanks for giving us like an overview of all of those things. And it sounds like you made a couple of transitions. So it'll be nice to like hear from you and your story and like how all of that has taken in. Now, before we dive in too deep into like transitioning and helping teacher transitions, we get this question, I'm sure you do, and I do often. Teachers always want to go into instructional design. And we'll say this about instructional design is that instructional design can look different within any space that you're operating. So we're going to, and Ben will share this from him as well, but more so his story and his experience as an instructional designer, because it does vary from place to place. But I think it's important to share your aspect of what an instructional designer looks like for you. And because that's just, everyone wants to go into instructional design. So I think it's good for us to outline what exactly that looks like and, you know, what your day-to-day entails and what are the things that you're responsible for and all of those types of things.
Absolutely. So I think in the broadest terms, for those who might be less familiar, instructional designers are creating learning materials and experiences that not only help people to learn, but to apply knowledge and skills. So that obviously is a broad definition. It means that that kind of work can take a variety of forms. In more academic contexts, that tends to align more with course production, course design, curriculum design, assessment, etc. But in corporate and nonprofit worlds, that oftentimes means things like training, onboarding, helping folks at an organization to either build or accrue new skills. So I tend to look at instructional design generally, but more specifically in my role, you are kind of serving four different roles simultaneously as an ID, right? In that you're part instructor, so you're always thinking about who is your audience and how do those people learn. Along with that, what is it that they need to learn? What is the situation in which you are designing content, whatever form that might take, right? So you're part instructor, you're part designer, thinking through the best ways to organize and present that information so that it's accessible, engaging, and memorable, and ultimately leads to an application of that knowledge. You are also part project manager. And I would say, especially depending on context and for academic IDs, you are working very closely with subject matter experts. You are receiving feedback, you're making continuous adjustments, and you are in some ways collaborating very closely and oftentimes receiving feedback or directive from multiple directions. So you are making sure as best as possible that you are meeting deadlines, you are making sure that various components are always sort of complete and effective with the knowledge that you will almost certainly quote unquote complete a project and then be given feedback that requires you to make a series of revisions and adjustments. And I think finally there's this element, especially in academic ID work, that you're part salesman, in that a lot of times I'm working with faculty who may never have taught online before, who may never have worked with an instructional designer before, who can very rightfully see me as this random guy who has come into their process with little to no discipline specific knowledge in most cases, who is then offering advice that may or may not be wanted, right? So you are, in some sense, helping SMEs to see your value and to see how you can facilitate and elevate all of the great work that they're already doing, and how you can make sure that their knowledge and expertise is translating effectively to their learners. Because I think even the best instructors struggle with that element of translation. Or I know for myself as an instructor, everything always made sense in my head, but whether or not that translated to students was oftentimes another matter entirely.
Yeah, I think that I like how you broke that down too, because I think oftentimes we just think about creating the content. So I always tell people that you do work with subject matter experts, which is someone who has an expertise in a subject. So, like if I taught fifth grade math, I would be the expert in fifth grade math, right? So you're working with someone and then you're translating that work in a way that's going to benefit the end user or whoever, students or whoever it is. And then I do really love that you said project manager, because I think that's an often misunderstood part, is that you will be managing projects from end to end. So that means whether you have a production team. So at Canva, I create the content, I create the wireframes, I send over what I want it to look like, and it goes to designers, and designers design it, comes back to me, and I give them feedback like, ooh, I didn't really like this, or I didn't like this, or they give me feedback like, Leena, this doesn't really tell in the way visually that you think it's going to. And then you go through and you do it, and then you deliver it, and sometimes the content is delivered just like you said, it may not hit as well, so you then have to take feedback and do feedback reviews. So I think as teachers, we only people tend to only give the feedback. You get feedback from students, the immediate feedback, but from your administration, you actually don't really get the feedback except for once or twice a year when they pop into your classroom and give you that feedback. So it's not as like meaningful, but you have to be able to take the feedback and understand that it's not personable. It's not, it's not, they're not trying to attack your character and be like, oh my gosh, that's just the worst work you've ever done, blah, blah, blah. It's like, hey, you can modify and revise this because it can be better. And you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt, because I know there's been a lot of people, and even sometimes myself, and sometimes I get sensitive about it. I'm like, okay, well, that's my work. I just put my heart and tears into that. But, you have to understand that it's not meant to hurt your feelings, but meant to actually amplify and make your work shine in a better way.
Exactly. And I think it really is important to recognize with all the folks you're collaborating with that you share the same goals. You want the best learning experience possible. You might violently disagree about how to get there or methodology or approach, but ultimately there's far more overlap than discordance. So I think being able to not only accept and internalize that feedback, but to filter through what is going to work in a given context for a specific audience is also really important for anyone who wants to transition into any variation of ID work.
Yeah. And I think when I think about it as like how would an educator see the role of ID in what you do in day to day, I think it's like if you were going to lead a really big professional development workshop and launching a new program or launching something, and you have to put together the training material that's going to translate to teachers to make sure that they can understand it and that they will then be able to translate it to their students. It's kind of taking that big project and you have a bunch of people who may be helping you in it. You may be organizing, you may be developing the training materials, or you may be doing all of the things or adapting them for your audience. So it's kind of taking that and kind of delivering it on a much larger scale than just to your students, because you do that as an instructional designer daily, with your students. But I think it's more about broader scale impact than just like the smaller bits sometimes in your classroom. Not always, but that's typically, I don't know. It's more like the larger reach, I guess, that you can have.
Yeah. Being able to balance those micro level concerns with macro level impact and being mindful of how decisions throughout the process ultimately impact or just determine the quality and transferability of whatever it is ultimately created.
Yeah. In your work in instructional design, this isn't something we talked about before, but I know a lot of times teachers or people transitioning to instructional design I always see them in like the instructional design Facebook groups or, anything. They're always really honing in on tools that you need to have and what tools do you work with. So are there any specific tools that you tend to work with in your space while doing your ID work?
Yeah, so my transition took an exorbitantly long amount of time, in part because I didn't initially hone in on ID work. So I spent a lot of time trying to upskill and improve my technical knowledge and essentially completing any free course that I could find, any LinkedIn learning module that would help me understand various facets of different roles. But what I would say the two biggest kind of technical elements to learn are LMS or learning management systems, right? Particularly if you're looking at academic ID roles, but more broadly, looking at those, authoring tools like Rise and Storyline. And I burned through multiple email addresses trying to get kind of free trials of different tools and just building things on my own and stumbling my way through because though almost every ID job description you will see regardless of what sphere it's in is going to mention the authoring tools that are most commonly used by a given company. So as you're looking at open roles, start taking notes. What tech are you seeing? How visual is the tech you're required to learn, right? Are they wanting you to know InDesign or Canva or Illustrator? What is it that you're going to need to know? And to be perfectly frank, I'm a neophyte in almost all of those things, but know enough to be able to ask good questions to solve the problems that I encounter every day. But I would say, understanding and devoting significant time to those course authoring tools is really important. And even if as a transitioning instructor, you take old materials from an old course that you've taught, start playing around with how to develop that as an ID module. Not only will that help you learn those tools, but that potentially gives you something to put in a portfolio, which also brings in have some kind of portfolio. And I say that very hypocritically as someone who has very little in the way of a portfolio, in part because of IP constraints. and what I am allowed or not allowed to share professionally. But much in the way that your sort of online brand and content can become your calling card as an applicant, so can or so should your portfolio,
Hmm.
right? Eventually, someone is going to probably ask for that, ask for samples of your work, because as an applicant in general, but as a career transitioner in particular, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. And being able to highlight your physical work is really how you can prove that understanding and that ability to work with those tools effectively.
I, I love what you just said. It's not what you know, it's what you can prove. I do speak to many people and they're like, oh, well, how can I show, my instructional design capabilities? And I think you nailed it. I think you take something that you're already teaching right now and you adjust it in the way that makes sense for instructional design, whether that's learning a tool like Rise or Articulate or whatever all those other tools are, Canva, I don't know, whatever you want to use, whatever it's saying in the job description. Because just like you, I'm familiar with all of them. Am I an expert in any of them? Probably not, but I could learn it if I need to, so it doesn't like stress me out, but I know enough to work through them if I need to. But I think what people are missing sometimes is the portfolio piece of it, and making sure that you have something to show what you've done. Because even as an educator, even though you have the background of working with lots of SMEs, or taking the content and turning it into instructional coursework or whatever it is that you've done, you don't necessarily always have the proof because you're just moving through every single day. But me, as somebody who's looking to hire someone to add to our team, the first thing I want to look at is your work. I want to see what you've done, what you've been able to create. And I think oftentimes the portfolio seems to be the last piece. It's like, oh yeah, I want to do all these other things, but not the portfolio. But the portfolio is actually the thing that's going to, I don't know, it's really gonna show you in a different way. And that's important. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to build a WordPress site. You don't have to do all of this. You can keep it simple, but you need to let the work speak.
Yeah, and I think anything that can differentiate you from a sea of other applicants, and in many cases, a sea of transitioning teachers, whether that's content you're building and sharing on LinkedIn, whether that's not even thinking in terms of specific ID tools, but create a Google site for yourself. There are a million free ways to highlight your skills, ability, to show your work, even if it's not directly applicable to a given role, but having something that you can kind of point someone toward and say, oh, if you want to learn about me, go here. If you want to learn about my work and what I'm capable of, go here. So that you're, again, I think differentiating yourself in the best way, because you're not only giving someone the tools to understand you, but you are creating something that you can continue to build and refine as your career progresses. And I think the hardest thing to do is to start that site or start that portfolio, because it's going to probably be kind of facile and not be great. But you know what? It's probably still better than everyone who has nothing to
Mm-hmm.
point someone toward.
Yep. Yeah, and as you're speaking, I was thinking to myself, wow, do I have my portfolio? I don't think I have one, and I probably should probably I should probably get that together because I haven't updated mine in 100 years. But I agree with you. I think having something is better than nothing. And I know that my friends who are recruiters and they go to someone's LinkedIn, not only are they looking at their posts and comments and things like that, but they are looking, if you have your portfolio, they'll look at it right away and they'll be like, oh, yeah, I definitely want to look. Experience is one thing, but the showing of the experience, proving the experience is the most important part. And if you have that portfolio, it just can really speak dividends. And no one's expecting you to be an A+ designer. Okay. You don't need to have your stuff look like, a graphic designer created it. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking to see the content and how you translated it and and how you broke it down to make it accessible for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note as well. You don't have to be an expert at everything. Chances are you're going to be collaborating with various folks on any project, right? So any course that I'm working on, if there's video content, I have a video producer who I'm collaborating with, and the three of us, right, the instructor, myself, and a VP are working together because video is their expertise. It's not mine. But for the most part, no one is expecting me to have that expertise. That's its own role. The same way that I think in a lot of, especially more established corporate roles, right? You are likely to have graphic designers, and some of that may fall to you, but a lot of it won't. Or you might be expected as an ID to be creating simpler digital assets on a regular basis. But when it comes to the big, bright, shiny, hopefully there's a graphic designer waiting in the wings to collaborate with on those things, unless you're working at scrappy bootstrapped startup, in which case everyone is doing everything all of the time.
Yep. Yeah, you usually have other people that you're working with. Like you said, you might write the script for the video producer or the production manager or whoever it is that you're working for. So it's just making sure that you can adequately explain that. And I think your writing background, it's probably extremely, extremely helpful for the work that you're doing in instructional design, because sometimes we even have copywriters who review our work. And so that probably eliminates an extra step for you because you have that like expertise. But I think, I don't know, I think it's also like it's often a lot of writing and scripting and being descriptive. So oftentimes a lot of the people that I work with, I don't do this specifically at my role, but they'll create like the videos that you see on YouTube or tutorials or those types of things. And they'll write the full script and then write how they want it to look. And it will go to, production. It will go to a screen recorder. It will go to someone. So the more descriptive you are and the better you are at being able to describe something, the better the turnout and the less amount of iterations of feedback rounds that you'll have to have because you were as descriptive as you could be at first.
Yeah, when we're talking about soft skills related to ID work, the ability to communicate clearly, effectively, and succinctly won't necessarily show up in job posts, but is so incredibly important. Or I think any teacher who has worked with folks who are not clear, effective communicators know how much that waylays any process. So anything you can do to facilitate point A to through point Z in a project through effective communication and good writing is really beneficial. Particularly when we're thinking about the project management elements of what you're working on as an ID.
Yeah. And I've had to get really good at that. I'm not like the best communicator. I'm not the best at communicating. You'd be surprised, but really adequately saying like at this point I need this, at this point I need this point I need this. It's something that I've had to like learn and really like hone in on and become better at. Because teachers, you're not communicating like that written through to people, and so at first I'd be kind of like, and I'm a teacher, so you try to give that like positive reinforcement and feedback, but that's like actually not what you need. You need to be very constructive with the feedback that you're given. And so I've had to really work on giving that like constructive feedback and making sure that it's meaningful. And so I think if you can take anything from either one of us, is that we've had to learn how to adapt some of our skills in things. Like we're saying that we are not experts in everything, and you have to know that you can't be an expert in everything either, that we're constantly learning. And I heard you say upskill. Like those are really, really things that are important that we continuously do.
Yeah, I think across the board, there is a lot of parallel skill and parallel kind of experience, but it's rare to have those one-to-one correlations when you're switching careers. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's an element that makes switching careers so difficult
Yep.
and oftentimes so time consuming, or far more time consuming than we might think or might hope. At least that was very much the case for me.
Yeah, I've had to do like a lot of learning. And I think that's just like, when I transitioned, I thought like, oh, this is going to be so great. But you have more eyes on you. You have to be more descriptive. You have to really share what you're doing. And then we use project management tools like Monday or Trello boards or those types of things. You have to be really clear and really succinct on what you're sharing and really transparent about everything that you're doing. And, in the classroom, nobody's checking everything that you're doing, right? Like nobody's like, oh, what are you doing at ABCD time? Like, not that a manager is doing that to you, but they want to see the lesson that you've created and what exactly aspects, what assets are going there. So, what part of the lesson, what videos are you using, what thumbnails and images, and like all of those things all have to be put together in like a nice package to be able that anyone could pick it up and figure out what it is that you're doing. So, yeah, I like that. Yeah. So, Ben, I think this is really important because you and I are both transitioners from the education space and that sort of thing. And you transitioned a couple times from journalism to going into the, being the writing center director and going into academia. And now you're in instructional design in academia. What are some of the steps or some of the things that you found to be important when doing the career switching or transitioning that you feel like other people should keep in mind?
So my career shift from journalism into academia was much simpler than moving from the classroom into my current role, in that I essentially knew, okay, here are the additional degrees that I need to earn and begin to teach as a graduate student and building that experience, right? But there was a very clear and specific pipeline to do that. Whereas I think one challenging element for instructors moving out of the classroom is that there's not a clear direction. There's not rails that you can just hop on and know, okay, this is exactly what I have to do in this order in order to get to this next role, right? So if we're thinking about, for me, what are the key steps for a successful career switch? One, give yourself time. Give yourself more time than you need. Be generous. I started thinking about my career switch in, late 2020, and it didn't happen for another couple of years. And part of that was because, one, I didn't have a clear, specific direction. So I was researching and learning and connecting with and networking with all sorts of different people in a half dozen fields, all of which I thought, that sounds interesting. There's a correlation between my previous experience and those things. Maybe I'll want to do that, right? And along with that process, knowing that there are all these things that I need to learn in order to actually not only talk about those industries and those professions in any kind of capable way, but to also understand the nature of that work, right? Because I think because so many edtech roles and non-academic roles sound so similar, both in terms of title and job description, you really have to take the time to understand, what is the difference between customer service and customer success? What are the differences between all of the variations and permutations of instructional design? All of that takes time, all of that takes research. So while you're doing that, I'm a huge advocate of networking. I started posting on LinkedIn in, late 2020 to find other educators as that contingent of the platform was really booming. For the first time, you really saw academics and educators getting on LinkedIn, communing with one another, connecting with one another, and working to build networks, right? And I will also say, I think your network is potentially so much more valuable than your resume. I currently, or the role that I currently hold, I got because of LinkedIn. It was because my boss saw content that I was creating, about instructional design and about teaching. And he messaged me and said, "Hey, we're about to hire a number of new entry level IDs. Would you be interested in chatting?" And I immediately said yes, right? He didn't see my resume. He didn't see a portfolio other than the content I was already sharing. But that's what got my foot in the door. And having LinkedIn as a tool where, very selfishly, I was following a litany of IDs just to learn from them and to engage and to be in the comments and be a part of those discussions and to be active with those individuals, not necessarily thinking in terms of referrals or getting job offers, but simply as a means of learning and engaging with that discourse community that I'm trying to be a part of, but really wasn't at the time. So networking, I would say, is incredibly important, right? Just as, if not more important than your resume. For all transitioning instructors, I would say be humble. Recognize that everyone currently in that field has more direct experience than you. Recognize that you have a lot to learn and be willing to take some criticism, to weather some tough love from folks in the field. You might not agree with all of the feedback that folks offer your way, and they might not even always be correct, but you need to be able to critically think about what advice am I receiving? Where is that advice coming from? And be humble enough to filter out what might not be useful and to absorb and synthesize any good advice. And as I've said before, the I think another key to a successful transition is to be able to tangibly prove to someone who doesn't know you that your work has been valuable. One thing that I really struggled with was putting metrics onto my work. And I remember there was a few week period where I literally sat down and counted up how many workshops have I led? How many hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants have I helped people get? How many books have I edited? How many theses and dissertations have I edited? How many faculty members have I worked with? So that on my application materials, I could put all of those descriptions into clear, concrete terms, right? And I realize that's not always possible, but a lot of times it is. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not good enough or it's not effective to say, I'm really enthusiastic and I'm a really hard worker. Good for you. Who cares? Who isn't those things? If you can't put your work into terms that someone in a different industry can understand, you are setting yourself up for failure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really unfortunate, but it's really true. And I know that because I spent the better part of a year not clearly articulating my experience and wondering, I wonder why I'm not getting as many interviews as I would think. I know that I'm perfect for this role, but why didn't they get back to me? And it was because I was doing a terrible job of explaining my experience in the parlance or the rhetoric of, the kind of KPIs that a whole other industry literally needs to hear in order to understand, value.
Yes. And I'm so happy that you said something about metrics because most times when I am sent a resume or someone sends me something and I'm like, hey, you need to say how many workshops you've done. You need to say how many stakeholders you work with. Whether that's kids or not, it doesn't matter because a regular person has no idea what a teacher does every day. An instructional designer doesn't know what a salesperson does every single day. Nobody is going to know that, but a salesperson might look at instructional designers portfolio because they want them to join the team to translate some content for them. So you never know what stakeholder is going to be reviewing it. But if you have clearly articulated numbers and facts in a way that makes sense for someone who knows nothing about you, they could read this bullet point and they say they know exactly what it is that you do in a very clear, tangible way, it's going to get you leaps and bounds more interviews, more exposure than somebody who writes, I delivered workshops to a team of teachers in the fall of 2019. That's it, right? It's what did you do? What were you teaching? What is it? What are you doing? Because nobody understands it. It's kind of like if you and I both are married, but like if we were dating someone and someone just says, I like to have fun. Cool. What is it that you like to have fun in? Do you like to party? Do you like to, I don't know, go skiing? Do you like to, there you need to be more specific because people know nothing. They know nothing about you. They won't know anything about you, and that's okay. But you need to make sure that when they look at this, they're like, oh my gosh, this person has the exact experience I want them to have for this position. It's just like that. It's like a blind date. Nobody knows anything about you. It's just the truth. Or like meeting a friend for the first time, right? You meet them for coffee, you know nothing. So what do you start talking about? Very basic things. And it's not until you dive into deeper connection things of things you have interest in that you start connecting. It's the same thing with an employer.
And I think, unfortunately, a lot of educators are really trained not to brag. We don't talk about ourselves. We don't talk about our accomplishments. We focus on these other things. And that works to an extent in academia, but every other industry on the planet wants you to, for lack of a better term, brag about yourself and
Yeah.
your accomplishments and everything that you've done. So I think that that is
And
another
I'm the worst at
area.
that. The worst.
Yeah, not it. I think it's really hard in part due to just simple conditioning, right? And if you do see teachers kind of talking up their accomplishments, it's unfortunately seen as sort of gauche or unnecessary, or you'll receive criticism for it. But that's not how the rest of the world works. And hiring managers, recruiters want you to not only, talk up those accomplishments, but when you land those interviews, you need to be able to succinctly tell your story so that someone, even if you only have a 20-minute interview, understands who you are, where you've come from, what you've done, and why you're interested in that next role. Right. So that balance of being informative and being persuasive simultaneously in as few words as possible is another kind of intangible skill that I think we don't talk nearly enough about when talking to transitioning teachers and job seekers.
I totally agree with you. I actually was going to mention something. We talked about this before we actually hit record. And I'm sad that we didn't have this long conversation ready for you, but we will talk about it now. I want to ask you two questions. One is, how was the switch of becoming, obviously you said, becoming a journalist and becoming, an educator, there was like a really clear pathway. But once you decided that you wanted to go to like instructional design and you left, the role that you've known for quite some time, and then you transition into ID, one, how did that feel for you? And two, I know that you mentioned taking an entry level ID position, even though you have a ton of background in other things. I'd love for you to expand on, I guess, both of those. How did you feel when you transitioned to an instructional design? And then that, like, I don't know, people often think like they hear entry level and they're like, ooh, I'm not going to do that. But I've done it. I know you've done it. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that too.
So in terms of how I felt, it was great. One of the reasons that I sort of had to leave my last role was because it was so demanding, because the role was growing, but compensation and assistance never increased to meet that demand. So I was feeling a great deal of burnout. So even the start of my ID role, knowing that folks, and this is a credit to my employer, knowing that folks are very mindful of your time was a new experience. Not waking up to 50 emails every morning was a new experience. Not having to work nights and weekends so consistently, not feeling as though I was on call 24/7, in part because in my last role, I was overseeing a staff of 40 to 50 people. So you're constantly putting out other people's fires and solving other people's problems. And some of that never goes away, regardless of what you're doing. But just the instant bit of relief to know that some of those things were, at least to a degree, being ameliorated immediately. Also, knowing that it was a great feeling to be told, hey, we know you don't have extensive experience with some of these things yet. That's not why we're hiring you. We can train you to know and apply all of those things. We have systems in place to mentor you and to build those skills. We're hiring you because of all these other reasons. So that was a great kind of sense of relief as well. And, also the excitement of doing new things and learning new things was incredibly satisfying. Right. Another reason that I sort of transitioned was because I'd served in the same role for so long, and many elements of my job, as much as the day to day is different, things felt static in the worst way. So being able to do and see new things all the time was really refreshing.
I think saying that I think is important because I think a lot of times educators think, oh, I don't know, there's like a sense of guilt, I think, sometimes leaving teaching itself, and you're thinking like, you just have like this like guilt. But I think sometimes you have to do things for yourself. And so I think what you're
Oh,
saying,
it was an
learning
entry
new
level.
things and new tools, yeah, and like all of those things are, they're just important to like your growth as a human being. You have needs too, and you need to make sure that you are moving in that way. But I did want to touch on the entry level position because you're a writing center director, right? Like you are looking over 40 to 50 people, and now you're taking this entry level role. So one, it's okay to do that. I'm sure you will say that too. I've done it. You've done it. But I'd love to know how that kind of felt for you, being sort of on the top, right, like the top of the rung, and then kind of sliding back down. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So in order to transition into an ID role, I am essentially at entry level, which I think for a lot of people can be a hard pill to swallow. And I absolutely understand that. But for me, the goal was to accrue these skills, to build this experience. This was and is my foot in the door to further my career, to learn new things, to do new things, and find ways to apply new knowledge and skills. And to be perfectly transparent, the base pay is the same with my last role and my current role. I'm technically making significantly less money because in my last role, I was taking teaching overloads and I was taking on additional responsibilities that increased my salary by another 25%. Right. So I am very fortunate and privileged to be in the kind of position where I could make a lateral move in terms of salary and not have that be so economically detrimental that it wasn't possible to leave. I know that there are so many educators who don't have that privilege, who know that they need to make at least the same salary and hopefully much, much more. Right. But for me, the goal really was to create new opportunities for myself. And this was the best way to do it. And I'll be honest, you know, will I stick in the same role forever? Absolutely not. If staying at the same place for more than a decade taught me anything, it's that the way to make more money is to move around roles, move around companies. A 2% cost of living increase every year is not going to improve your earning power. The best way to make more money is to find those new roles, to find those new opportunities. If you're incredibly lucky, that might happen at your same employer or at your same institution, but that's very, very rare. So you might have to be prepared to not only take a lower position temporarily in order to build those skills, but to also recognize that this probably won't be your last transition. Hopefully, you'll be moving within the same field, but you probably won't be with the same employer from now until the time that you retire.
Two things on that note is that I speak with a lot of educators and they're like, well, I just want to, my next role is my last role. And it's like, no, that's not how that works. I mean, it could be, it's probably not the best idea unless you're getting some bit of more earning potential. But it's unlikely that your next role will be your forever role because you'll want to have more growth potential. You'll want to, experience new things. And once you're kind of, your foot is in the door, now you have more experience. You are, you know, being looked upon. So I would say your first step out of the classroom, think about it as a learning step. It's exactly that. It's a step in the right direction for where you want to go. It won't be your forever landing point, and that's okay. And then the second thing is, the entry level position sometimes turns a lot of educators off. And it's not that you don't have the experience to be in that role. However, you are, as Ben and I had talked about offline, you're in a sea of other applicants that do have that experience. So you may have to take an entry level position to showcase that. And we also talked about this offline, is that being an educator in a bubble is way different than being in a space that's not teaching. There's a lot of things you have to learn, communicating with a lot of stakeholders, learning how to manage these projects from end to end. It's just that you're going to have a very big, it's exciting. You will have a big everyone has a learning curve when they transition out of the classroom. It's a slower curve, and it's like more supported and guided, I think, as you transition in most places, not all roles. But I just think a lot of people are like, well, I can't do that. And it's like, I have so many skills. It's how many times we look on LinkedIn. It's like, I'm a teacher, hire me. And it's like, okay, that's cool. We love that about you, but you have to translate it in the right way. And you do have a lot of skills. You have to translate it.
And for any transitioning teacher or instructor who hears that advice and whose natural inclination is to be in any way defensive, what I would say is, imagine if schools started hiring random people from other professions who said, but I'm really smart. I could totally be a great teacher. And as an experienced educator thinking, could you though? Could you really? Because chances are you couldn't without some specialized training, without direct experience, or without opportunities to kind of start at the bottom, so to speak, and to learn and work your way up. So as much as I understand educators' inclination to have I have all these skills, please hire me attitude, and I have that as well, I also think it's really beneficial to look at the inverse of that equation and understand how other industries may fairly or unfairly also look at teachers.
Yeah, I totally agree. Okay, last question before we wrap up the interview today is, give me a hot take on career switching.
Just one?
No, you can give me a couple if you want.
Oh, nice. Okay. I have too many. So, rapid fire. First off, 90% of the people peddling courses and coaching are snake oil salesmen and charlatans. They are charging hundreds, if not thousands of dollars from what you can get from the first 3 pages of a judicious, well-crafted Google search. And worst of all, they're preying on desperation. And it is absolutely unconscionable. Now, if you are a coach or selling courses and that sentiment does not apply to you, great, walk on by. But I will die on the hill that most of those folks are not nearly as good at what they are trying to do as they think they are. Secondly, the ATS is not the reason you're not getting interviews. The ATS is merely a filtering system. research them, learn about them, learn how to exploit them. They are merely a program looking for keywords depending on the level of human intervention. And I can absolutely guarantee with nearly 100% certainty that the ATS is not why your job search is faltering. Network size does not equate to network quality. You can have a huge network in theory, but if you're not engaging, if you're not developing actual relationships, your network probably isn't going to help you. If you're just sending connection requests without building some sort of rapport ahead of time, if you are connecting with folks, but then not engaging and not contributing to their content and those conversations, you really aren't building a network at all. And finally, don't be afraid of creating content. Chances are no one is paying attention for a very long time. Not that my network is particularly big now, but for the first year and a half plus, it was crickets across the board. If I posted something that received even, 1,000 impressions, I was absolutely elated. If I had more than one like or comment, I was absolutely elated. And at the time, it was frustrating. It was demoralizing. But in hindsight, I wouldn't have it any other way because it meant that I got to make so many mistakes when no one cared, no one was paying attention, no one even noticed. And even now, no one's going back to look at that content. Why would they? It's never going to happen. I mean, you might get one weirdo, but no one is going back into content from 4 or 5 years ago. It's completely inconsequential, and don't let potential fear stop you from creating content or trying new things. And not only is it okay if some of those attempts fail, but ultimately it's for your own good and it's in the best interest in the long run.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, this has been so great. And I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story and how you made the transition, all of those things, and just being real and authentic with all those things. We both talked offline how we don't really, I'm not a sugarcoater and you're not either. And I appreciate that about you. If you're not already following Ben, definitely do so. He's sharing a lot of valuable content for people who are transitioning, especially those in the ID space. There's lots of real truths and, just authenticity coming from him. So I definitely recommend that you follow him. So Ben, if somebody did want to connect with you, where should they do it?
LinkedIn is by far the best place to find me. It's the only social platform where I'm genuinely and consistently plugged in. If you just search Benjamin Erwin on LinkedIn, I will pop up and you will see my big goofy face. And sorry, I intentionally have a goofy LinkedIn profile pic
No, I love it.
that has been called extremely unprofessional, in part because I want to stand out, and in part because my normal face looks like this. And it looks vaguely hostile at all times. So the impression, or the intention rather, was to try to look at whatever my version of warm and inviting was. And that was the best
No,
we could
I
do.
love it because I think it's what makes you unique, and I think that that's important in a sea of AI background photos. But I'll also share Ben's LinkedIn, obviously in the YouTube comments and in the description if you're listening to us on the podcast or wherever you're listening to us. But Ben, I just really, really thank you for coming on and sharing your insights and, just being so authentic. And I hope that all of you enjoyed it as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everybody. We'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much. You've made it this far. We are so thankful that you're here. Make sure to hit the subscribe button, thumbs up, comment below, and join us for all of our next videos. Thank you so much for joining us as we disrupt education together. See you guys soon. Bye, everybody.